Welcome to A World Gone Mad, where I am your host, Christian McMillan, and I am joined today by Liev Dalton from Beyond Terrain. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me on. Looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, absolutely. I had come across your content very organically, and it stuck out on Instagram because you're outside, you're in nature, you're soaking up the sun, and you're talking about very interesting, unique subjects. And it felt like this something really special shining in the heap of mind rot that can be social media.
Yeah, and it is mind rot, is it not?
A lot of it even instantly had me thinking about how you can work to at least curate your algorithm to be more mentally stimulating or have you focus more on your health and what you're feeding your mind.
Definitely. I'm glad you brought that up because I do try to practice what I preach a little bit. So I built an outdoor office to record my videos outside. Of course, you can't get away from it. Sometimes it's nice to record inside too. We certainly preach balance as well. But when I was off Instagram there for a while, and I like prior to starting up my Instagram page, which was about 8 months ago now, I created a new Instagram and I made sure that I followed only people who were posting educational content, and my algorithm was pretty good. The thing is about the algorithm is that if you do get sucked into the high dopamine videos, the algorithm will it knows it's all about you, right? So it's tailored to what you consume. So your algorithm is a reflection of what you're consuming. But you certainly can, but it takes a lot of strength to keep it at that, bland educational level, right? If your mind is there, you'll be all right, but can be tough and it's easy to get sucked in because that's what it's designed to do.
Yeah, it occurs so quickly. Even just a gentle hover, sometimes I'll notice the algorithm curate more instantaneously gratifying things.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question that you often ask your guests, and how would you define health?
Yeah, I love this question. Obviously, I ask it to all my guests and I get a different answer every time, which is really nice. For me, it's all about being able to achieve your goals and dreams in life. And if you have a goal or something that you want to achieve, or you have a purpose that you felt compelled to pursue, you felt a calling for it, uh, I believe that you're healthy if you're able to pursue that on a physical, mental, spiritual level. Of course, these are not separate, um, because health is really individual, right? It's honestly, it's how you define it. That's one thing that I've learned is that there is no real definition to health. It's kind of an interesting one. I'm sure we could sit down and, curate some sort of very logical definition for it. Um, Not that it would necessarily be useful, but yeah, I think it's just being able to pursue what you want to pursue. Of course, you have to work with the swings of life, and you could be dealt a poor hand, that's for sure. And hopefully you just leave better off than you came in. And you could think of that generationally. You could think of that on a financial level. You could think of that on a health level, a spiritual level, whatever it may be. Um, yeah, it's hard to really pin down a exact definition, but I like to look at it in that way. It's just sort of your ability to pursue what you find meaningful and give yourself meaning, and it looks different for everyone, right? Like someone, not everyone's going to have big goals. Not everyone is geared that way in a way, right? Some people just want to live a nice, peaceful life with lots of family and friends and happiness, and they just want to sit around. And that seems like a pretty nice kind of life to me, just a sort of
Absolutely.
easy life, and so it just depends on what you want, some people aren't motivated to get as absolutely healthy and optimal as possible because their body and their mind and their spirit is gearing them towards what they're pursuing, right? You do adapt to your condition or to your environment, sorry, you adapt to your environment. And so the environment you put yourself in is how you are going to set yourself up for the rest of your life, right? The environment that you create for yourself is going to be your environment not only now but in the future as well. So that's sort of my vague, abstract answer for health.
No, I like it. I like it. Particularly, I find a lot of your content has to do with how the individual fits into the greater collective, and that goes far beyond just humanity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It goes into the environment, into your natural environment, but largely we are social beings as well, right? So a few times the theme has come up of relationships as being a definition of health, having meaningful and good relationships, because there are certainly bad relationships out there as well.
Hmm.
Um, and you can think about relationships with your relationship to the land as well, your relationship to your environment, to the animals in your area, to all the way down to the microbes and up to the stars. It's I do really that definition, that sort of explanation for health really resonates with me too. How you relate to your environment, and that includes social, like biological, psychological, spiritual, and it relates to how you relate to yourself, right? The inner world as well. And your inner world is a representation of your external world. Uh, but there's certainly a good argument that, you create your world internally before we create it externally. So I think that's an interesting thing that I've been exploring a little bit.
Yeah, sort of like there's inter internal various perspectives that you're wrestling with as an individual, and whatever comes out victorious is what you bring to the plate for the rest of society and your interactions with your environment.
No, absolutely. Like if you don't have a good relationship with yourself, it's very hard to have good relationships with others. It's like the same as, well, I think it's an old maxim. It's like, you can't love anyone else without having a certain amount of self-love. You can't have compassion for others without self-compassion. You can't understand anything about the external world if you don't understand anything about your internal world, right? So definitely looking intrinsically is absolutely paramount as a starting point as well. Like before you step outside your house, you want to look inside your house for what's going on, and your relationships there and so that's, I really like that part of Jordan Peterson. And say what you will, like, I know he has some different things that we could probably disagree on, but one thing that always resonated with that he said was, you got to clean your room before you try and clean up the rest of the world. And I think that sort of fits into this discussion. And I couldn't agree more with that statement. I think that's genius and something that a very few people do,
Hmm.
and that's a very large responsibility. It's a great analogy. And it seems
Hmm.
ridiculous and foolish, but if I don't make my bed in the morning, it's guaranteed won't be as good of a day as if I did. So just something I've observed myself.
No, I absolutely agree. And I actually was curious to how you felt about him, because this is a sentiment I have observed in your content and your work. But I personally am a huge fan of that book, 12 Rules for Life. I found it extremely useful as a young man once upon a time who lacked any direction in his life. It is terrific advice.
I couldn't agree more. I think the book is phenomenal. I mean, am I going to agree with every scientific standpoint that he takes? Not necessarily. And um, now he's made a living, of course, in the more political realm of things, which I don't really care for much. I pretty apolitical. It's hard not to be involved in politics, but I mean, you just got to take care of yourself and your own community. I think that's, the most important thing to look after. And, um, but yeah, I mean, I listened to a lot of his lectures. I read all of his books, and I got a lot of value out of him. I think he's got an interesting perspective. He's certainly can be an overthinker. There's
Hmm.
sometimes where you're like, well, we're getting too far that it's like meaningless at this point. And I think you can go a little Oh, I don't even want to say that. I was going to say that you could go a little too deep, but I don't think you can go too deep, to be honest with you. So you know what? I kind of take that back.
Yeah, it's almost like he does a really good job sometimes of finding the balance between simplicity and complexity. And those rules for
Yeah.
life are really taking the complexity of the world and everybody's trying to organize it and find themselves in it and their place in their greater collective. But he does a great job of simplifying it to those basic structural foundations.
Yeah, and I mean 12 rules is a great starting point.
Yes.
Like that's kind of who I got into first. Well, there were a few, but he was one of the first, one of the first big books that I read, and it really, yeah, it was a catalyst certainly on my journey. I do think he does some great work. I really do. I think there are some vested interests there now, and I really like his old work versus I would suggest his old work versus I don't know, I don't watch his new videos now, but I'm sure there are still nuggets of wisdom in there.
hmm No, it is. I had read all his books myself, and I do think I enjoy probably put them on the same standing with each other, Maps of Meaning and 12 Rules for Life. But over time, it did seem like he had somewhat got sucked more and more into the political side of the discussion. And sometimes, honestly, I've said that he seems like he's become a parody of himself in moments when he gets so sucked into the culture war.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and
I,
I think there's a lot of things you could say about him. I mean, he's done some great things, and he speaks out for what he believes in, and that's all you can really do.
Mhm. Yeah, at the end of the day, it's genuine, if not anything else.
I do believe it so, I do believe that, he is himself. I do really think that. I know some people make the argument that he's some sort of controlled op or something. I just don't. I can't pay any attention to that sort of stuff anymore. I think it's kind of a waste of time to guess the intentions of other people's. But if I was going to take a guess, I think he was fairly genuine, especially in his early work.
I agree. I also think that on some subconscious level, human beings, we can tell when someone's being particularly performative, like they have ulterior motives. I think people wouldn't flock to such iconic people if they were nothing but plants.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, I would likely disagree with that a little bit because the majority of people, I don't think they recognize that. I think there are quite a few, like like look at celebrities, right? These are false idols,
hmm
and they provide little to no value above entertainment and pleasure. And people flock to them like they like love them like their family. And they don't know, like, you know what I mean? They're not providing any real value to their lives, but they still flock to these idols and think the same way as them. Like, look at the movement with Taylor Swift now. You see
Yeah.
everyone's the Swifties or whatever they call them, it's ridiculous. And they're just worshiping her on some insane level. And they have the biggest following. So I don't know. Maybe I hear I think I get what you're trying to say, and um, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's really hard to say at the same time.
There's probably a lot of broad intricacies within the notion of Shakespeare's the world is a stage and all of us are actors, because it is part of just being civil and having manners too, where we are all a little bit performative to some degree. And I guess it's probably down to the individual and how much they internalize that performance or what kind of performer each one of us chooses to be out in the world.
You know what? That's a really interesting point, and I think you know on a very true level, every time you step out of your house, you're putting on some sort of mask. I think it is really hard to be genuinely yourself. People tend to over-identify with interesting parts of themselves that they feel as though they want to convey to the rest of the world. And this isn't even in, we could extend this discussion many different ways, but even over identifying as an athlete or over identifying as, somebody with ADHD or over identifying with, a political party. There are many different things that you can identify yourself with, and each one is sort of a mask, right? You're constantly playing these roles, and it's really interesting how we tend to do that. And I think it's human nature as well. It's part of that social game. It depends on what you're trying to get out of the interaction. If you're in an environment where you need someone from a group of, or you need something from a group of people who you don't necessarily agree with, well, you're not going to be your fringe self. Like if I'm gonna, you know, trying to think of an example, but say you go to some sort of networking event and you're trying to make connections, you may not be out the gate telling everyone that germs don't cause disease, and they're the whole scientific academic industry as a profession is just absolutely trash and doesn't actually align with the true meaning of the scientific method, right? So,
Yeah.
having that understanding that you are playing these roles in certain environments, it all depends. And is that disingenuous? Is that wrong? Is that bad? I think it only really becomes bad when you can't disassociate from it. When you go home and that's still your persona, right? You're still locked in that over identification, and it becomes you. When you become your mask, that's when it really becomes a problem, I think. And oh, we could go, I think Jung would probably have a field day with this sort of conversation, but Jordan Peterson do probably. But I think that's a really interesting point, that we put these masks on in sort of every situation, even on social media, you put this mask on, like you become like I become this beyond terrain person when I'm doing Instagram, like it's even
Yeah.
I try to be as genuine and as possible. That's the one thing that I wanted with social media. If I was going to go on there, I'd unapologetically be myself, but it's easy to stray and slip away from that, and trying to remain as genuine as possible in all interactions, I think is something that we should all strive for, but I think it's a very challenging thing, and it depends on your own interests, right? Like I said earlier, like with the example I gave, if you're trying to get something out of an interaction, you can't necessarily be yourself fully if it's going to upset the other individual, and then they won't want to take part in any sort of relationship with you, so because there are always things, if you want to, someone's talking to you and you just want to tell them to shut the hell up or something, you can't, that may be your genuine response, but that may not be the courteous thing to do. So,
Yeah, and I guess it particularly would come down to the social setting as well, of how much somebody would respect something like social tact, or if a different circle might find the exact same maneuvering to be conniving.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
Because you might wear a different degrees of mask. Maybe you won't go in with your most controversial of statements, but maybe you'll dip your toe and you'll set the groundwork and you'll see if you can gently introduce people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it comes out naturally too. I think it's hard. It's a lot harder to be disingenuine than it is to be your genuine self. I think it causes you more grief in the end than anything. So, and it'll come out, the truth always prevails. The truth
Mhm.
always prevails. You can hide things and try and be conniving, and it never lasts. It never lasts. Eventually it comes out, and if it comes out subconsciously, it doesn't come out as you'd want it to come out.
I agree.
When you let it come out unconsciously, it won't. You're a lot better facing it and being yourself. It's always easier in the end. So I think that's a really important thing too.
Yeah, almost like the Jungian notion of a dark side and needing an outlet or channel for it, something to befriend rather than repress until it gets a hold of you one.
I love Jung. I really love his work. I think he has a really interesting way to explain it. It's resonated with me a lot. Jung resonated with me a lot, and I find it very valuable. I don't think it's for everyone at the same time. Like that's the thing with all of these different notions of explaining the structure of the psyche or how our relationships work or whatever it may be. some explanations are going to resonate with some people and some aren't going to resonate with the others. You know what I mean? It just kind of depends on the individual, and you're trying to find that meaningful way to explain things and understand things for yourself. I know a lot of people that, you know, and even in Jung's work, that's why I love Jung's work, because when you do study personality types in depth, you can understand it that there are more abstract people and there are more concrete people, and everybody has this duality within them. Everyone is abstract and concrete, but one is primary function. And, the abstract people tend to like Jung, whereas the concrete ones could care less about that sort of speculation about the structure of the psyche, because who really gives a shit? Let's just kind of focus on what's in front of us. So it all depends. And that's why I love Jung, because it's right there. He kind of had that understanding too that, not even everyone would like his work. And I don't think he necessarily said that, but that's kind of what I gather from it.
No, I think the notion's there, even with his interest in things like the mystic or astrology.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. He wasn't afraid to have a look at, the unpopular opinion, which I really admired about him. He found a lot of value in the alchemical tradition, even though, you use alchemy as the example of pseudoscience, but that's projection in my opinion, because I think there's a lot more truth to the alchemical tradition than people give it credit for. And I think people think about it too concretely as well, right? It may be a more abstract thing, not even necessarily to say that the concrete explanations aren't possible in existence. I wouldn't go so far to say that it's impossible. I don't necessarily think anything's really impossible, but there's certainly some sort of underpinning to this reality, and I think the alchemist had a great understanding of that. And Jung saw it in his work, and that's part of the alchemical tradition, the microcosms and the macrocosms of reality, how everything operates in the same way on different levels or frequencies or however you want to describe it on a micro versus a macro scale. It's all the same, just on different levels. So that's what I liked about Jung. I like a lot about Jung.
No, I do as well. Even it seems like a great deal of my favorite writers are very influenced by him. Like Jordan Peterson is somebody very constructive self-help, but someone else who comes to mind is I really like Robert Greene, and you could tell
Oh yeah.
in their work they both love Carl Jung.
Absolutely. I haven't read Robert Greene, believe it or not. It's always been on my list, and I've just put it off, and that's something I should probably explore. I've listened to him speak a few times on different podcast episodes and things like that, but didn't get into his books. That's definitely on the list though, and it's been there for a long time.
Yeah, I haven't read them all, but they're it's so much to ingest that I find the ones that I have read, I often go back and reread parts of them, if not the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure.
I wanted to ask actually about you had alluded to it a bit earlier, but I had seen some posts and they were talking about the notions of contagion and toxicity. And I was wondering if you could get more into your particular takes on that. Because at a quick glance, I could give the cliff notes, but I'd like to make sure I really understand.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, this is sort of the big thing that I've been studying for the last 4 years now. And not that I'm straying away from it now, I'm sort of going more in depth than ever. But, the first thing that I'll say is that it seems insane and it sounds crazy, but it only sounds crazy because you were told this story from birth about contagion and microorganisms and viruses causing illness. And it was that understanding, it's that belief that that is what's true that inhibits people from looking at this argument. They don't want their world shaken, and that really gets in the way of even just considering an alternative argument. And to me, at this point, it sounds so absurd, the argument for the germ theory. So I'll get into it here in brief. Let's see how brief I can do this. So essentially, the large claims that I make is that, and not, I didn't synthesize any sort of information here. I'm not going to take any credit for it. Really, it started with Antoine Béchamp, who was a rival of Louis Pasteur, and Louis Pasteur is sort of the father of the germ theory. So the germ theory is essentially this notion that microorganisms cause infectious illnesses, right? And a lot of them can be transmitted through air, they can be transmitted through blood or water, or whatever it may be. There are different methods of transmission for these different infectious diseases. Now, Béchamp understood that the microorganisms are not the cause of illness, but they are the response to a toxic environment. And this toxic environment can be caused, and I should not say necessarily toxic, but I should say a diseased environment, because a diseased environment can be caused by one of three things or a combination of the three. You have toxicities and deficiencies as well as traumas. And the traumas can be physical, say you fall and you break your arm, and they can be emotional, say you're neglected as a child, and or you lack sort of relationships, or you lack meaningful relationships, or you lack purpose, or things of this can cause physical illness in individuals. And so all disease really comes down to these three factors. And so toxicity includes anything in excess that's natural, and I think that anything that's created artificially and synthetically, especially from, say, petroleum, uh, any amount would be considered toxic in excess because it's foreign to our realm and our reality and our biological systems. Toxicity can also include artificial electromagnetic frequencies, which our bodies, again, are not used to. And there's a great book, The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, which I would highly, highly recommend as an introduction to this sort of notion, because it explains the flu, which is sort of a gateway into the terrain paradigm, the terrain way of thinking. I'll mention deficiencies before moving on here quickly. Deficiencies, I wouldn't necessarily go as far as say that you can have vitamin deficiencies. I think that's been largely not necessarily disproven, but never proven true. But I think you can have deficiencies in real food, and you can have likely deficiencies in minerals. You can have deficiencies in love and sunlight and nature. There are many different ways to categorize these things, but they do all contribute to disease. So the sort of prevailing ideology, in a way, I don't wouldn't necessarily consider it that, but now we have this terrain paradigm, and many people called it the terrain theory, but it's not really a theory, because it's not built upon any sort of scientific, how should I word this? There's certainly a lot of scientific evidence for it if you're doing true science. It doesn't necessarily fall into this category of theories, because it's sort of this framework. The terrain paradigm, the terrain framework is that, we are individuals who respond to our environment, and our internal environment is a depiction of our external environment. And so the germ theory is sort of builds off this terrain theory as well. If you have microorganisms in your environment, then they can get within you and cause disease. That was sort of a theory, but that theory has been largely proven false. And so really the evidence for it is that, if you go and read any contagion study ever conducted in a controlled manner, there are no positive results that indicate contagion by any sort of microorganism, whether it be viruses, parasites, fungus, or bacteria. There is absolutely no empirical evidence for this. And I've spent a lot of time researching this. And initially, when I came to this information, I was in my second year in university, and I was taking microbiology. I couldn't have been more on the germ theory side of things. And when I encountered this terrain paradigm every day for years, and I still do, I tried to prove the germ theory correct by going back and reading the old papers, the original papers, and then novel papers as well. All of them provide absolutely no objective evidence. Uh, they all are false inductions based on our preconceived notions and worldviews. and we sort of spin our observations to fit the story that we've been telling since the time of Louis Pasteur. And so that there's a lot to unpack there, right? And I spoke about this a lot on in my introductory lectures on YouTube. If you're really interested in it, you can go and read those or listen to those first. Episodes 2, 3, and 4 really tell the story very well and comprehensively, from the fall of the germ theory to the rise of the trained model, and how really the trained model is the original model. And if you study any sort of medicine in antiquity or even beyond, or traditional Chinese medicine or any sort of ancestral medicine, they're certainly alluding to this terrain, right? That we have this terrain, and so you could look at it from many different lenses. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack. Largely, there is no contagion of microorganisms. And so the question that I'll answer real quick, because I always get this question, is, why do we perceive contagion? And the answer is simple, is that, we share environments. And so if everyone in my household lives in the same house and we do similar things, we'll likely manifest similar symptoms at the same time,
Hmm.
because it's likely that we're undergoing similar cycles and we're living in the same conditions. So if you live in a house and you live with drywall and building materials and things like that, those are toxicities, of course. And there are many other toxicities that houses can have. Even just the stagnation of air can be problematic. No windows or no air exchange, or, dusty air exchange, which we know dust is largely, they say it's like upwards of 95% microplastics, right? So we share toxic environments. The same with schools. Children share 8 hours a day, this toxic environment, and then they go home to another environment, which there may be some emotional trauma there as well at home. You never know. And so the majority of kids get sick at the same time, but not all of them do. That's the interesting thing, is why don't all the kids get sick? Well, maybe they go home and they have a really healthy home. Maybe they eat better than some of the other kids. Maybe their parents don't buy them Lunchables. So it's a very complex thing at the same time. It's simple, but it's complex. It's that essentially we
Hmm.
share environments, but when you're getting into the nitty gritty of specific anecdotal examples, you have to look at the individuals involved. It's like during COVID, I tried to catch COVID as hard as I could, to try and prove the germ theory right. I was a mask vigilante. I would pick up masks off the streets because I was combating the 2 million masks a minute being thrown out, so it was kind of funny
Yeah,
endeavor there. I really did a number on it. I think I collected like a couple thousand, eh? No,
that's what it
didn't
was, a
even
crazy
scratch the
amount.
surface. So but that's the thing, is that we share environments, and that's it can be difficult to understand initially, but when you start thinking about it more, even with chicken pox, people will bring kids with chicken pox into their home and it doesn't give them chicken pox, but if you take them to their home, it will. So there's different examples, right? We can't necessarily reduce it to that sort of explanation either, because it's very individual, a case by case thing, but it always comes down to toxicities and deficiencies. And we know that our food systems are deficient. So if you're shopping at Superstore, you're eating deficient food. If you're shopping at Sobeys in the grocery stores, I should say, I shouldn't say the brands, right? If you're shopping at these grocery stores, you're eating deficient food. That's the simplicity of it. So unless you're going above and beyond and getting really nutritious whole foods, and those who shop in the butcher and the seafood and the produce section versus the aisles with all the processed garbage are going to do better than, so it always comes down to this deficiency, toxicity, or psycho-emotional trauma, as well as physical trauma. So you might have a few questions, because that was a lot to unpack.
No, it's a great deal, but I'm extremely intrigued. And I like the way you bridge into it as a controversial subject, because it does. Why it caught my eye, because it just sounds so outlandish. But your reasoning is very fascinating, as well as the fact of course, I haven't looked at the research personally, but it being your field of study, I trust that you have. But it's so much to unpack that I'm even in this moment still taking it in.
And the interesting thing is that now there's more people than ever working towards this terrain movement. You have the Baileys, Dr. Mark and Sam Bailey, who are doing some phenomenal work. You have Dr. Andrew Kaufman, Dr. Tom Cohen, Dr. Bear Lando. You have Alex Zeck. You have, the boys over at the Terrain Theory podcast. You have the undercover virologist. You have, there are a plethora of people talking about this now more than ever. And another one I should mention is Mr. Daniel Roitas. He wrote a phenomenal book on Can You Catch a Cold? And in this book, he outlines, hundreds of studies, of contagion studies, and he goes over them in depth and highlights a lot of the problems within these studies. And it's very easy to understand, and it's an enjoyable read as well. It's a great place to start. There's there's plenty of literature out there on it now, and there's more and more coming. The Baileys wrote The Final Pandemic to sort of make it an easier to understand story around this whole COVID narrative that happened, right? Because that's still buzzing in people's minds, but it's a big topic, and there's many ways that, again, it comes down to the individual. What affects the individual? If the individual has had a sexually transmitted disease, sexually transmitted, right? Um, that may be a point where it's a point of friction that they can't get by. They can't understand how they got the sexually transmitted disease. If it wasn't some sort of microorganism that was passed from their friend or their partner who they had some sort of one night stand with at some point, who also had this disease. But the problem is that they don't realize that they both live a very fast, meaningless lifestyle, devoid of any sort of real joy, and they seek out this fast sex, this pleasure, and they drink 3 times a week and maybe dabble in some hard drugs, and they develop this sort of immune dysfunction disease that you could categorize as AIDS, and they go get an HIV test, and then they say that they've had this HIV, you know, disease transmitted. And it's just the tests in themselves. We could delve into the fallacies of the tests for hours and hours on end, and how the problems with the testing, and how they're arbitrary, and they impose absolutely no validity or reliability, especially antibody tests. If you look at the literature, antibodies are the most unreliable source of any sort of method in science. And it's admitted because there are companies and databases, and their aim is to improve the use of antibodies in research. Because there's this
Okay.
thing called the reproducibility crisis, and it occurs largely in psychology, and it occurs a lot in medical research and cancer research and immunology, because when you use antibodies in research, you cannot reproduce the results of the study. So reproducing a study, reproducibility is the cornerstone of science.
Absolutely.
If you have true findings, you should be able to set up that study in the same exact way, which is why we write method sections of papers, and you should be able to get the same or at least extremely similar results every single time. You should at least get statistically significant results every single time if you had statistically significant results in the last study, and the same statistical analysis should be used, of course. But that it's a huge problem, right? So we lack this, we tend to think that we're so scientific, but you could be very, very critical of the scientific literature and the methods used, and often there are a great number of problems and challenges within the methods used, and we've strayed so far away from the proper use of the scientific method. And I'm sort of straying away from our conversation of germs here, but I started with the AIDS, understanding that there was no connection between an HIV test and AIDS. And the first book I read was Inventing the AIDS Virus by Peter Duesberg. And the foreword was by Kary Mullis. And he was a Nobel Prize winner. He won the Nobel Prize for inventing the polymerase chain reaction test, PCR. So when he invented the PCR test, he actually stated that the PCR should never be used to diagnose any sort of infectious illness. And I know I'm sort of appealing to authority here a little bit, but He explicitly stated that you can detect any genetic sequence with any PCR test, and it depends on the cycle counts, the cycle threshold. And so if you run the PCR at a very high cycle threshold, it leads to more false positives. I'll spare you the long-winded explanation for that.
Okay.
But, if you run at a lower threshold, say 33 cycles,
Okay.
it leads to more reliable results for genetic sequencing testing. Um, and that's exactly what I learned in my undergrad. When I was taking genetics, we learned in depth the steps of PCR, and my professor stated that you should never run a PCR test above 33 cycles because it becomes arbitrary and useless and unreliable. Anything under 33 cycles. And she told me explicitly that no studies would ever get published if they use PCR tests above 33 cycles. And during COVID, they tested people at 45 cycles, which would lead to an almost, 95% false positive rate, some studies would suggest.
Okay.
And and it's extremely common in the research. Just the other day, I posted on my story, they found H5N1 in raw milk. And they're trying to tell us not to drink raw milk anymore because there's this H5N1 virus in it. You know how they detected it? PCR, among a couple other meaningless methods such as antibodies and electron microscopy.
Okay.
They ran it at 45 cycles in the study. It's bad science. The PCR in general shouldn't be used to diagnose these things. So I started with the AIDS thing, which was sort of a big one. And I started there, I think, because it was the thing that I was stuck on. I was like, okay, well, I can get behind, the flu not being caused by a microorganism, it's caused by our environment. I can get behind all these other, infectious diseases. A really easy one to dispel. It's likely just a heavy metal toxicity. Um, and there's another great book there, The Moth and the Iron Lung by Forrest Moretti. Tells a beautiful story of polio, how it's not caused by some sort of virus. But I started with AIDS, and it was a big one, and it was well worth it. There's the most literature out there on AIDS not being caused by HIV. That is the largest body of literature out there. There's the who was there's a couple groups out there. The Perth group does a lot against the whole AIDS argument. A lot of the old school guys were against that. The old school terrain guys. So it's a, it's a fun place to start, and it's a fun thing to study if you're into it. I mean, it's a great thing if you're into science. Look into it. If not, the way that I approach it is that blaming some sort of microorganism for your illness is a way to play the victim mindset. You're not taking responsibility for your health. You're not taking responsibility for your environment. People will say, "Oh, I got the flu this year because it's random. I just caught it." But then they don't look into they're eating a shit diet. They don't move their body. They don't go outside. They don't have any good relationships. They don't have relationships with their parents. They don't have any meaning in their life. They work some dead end job and they sit in a chair for 12 hours a day because they work 8 hours in an office. And they come home and then they lay on the couch for the other 12 hours of the day. And they lay on the bed for, whatever. You know what I'm trying to say. They never stand up. There's no movement.
Yeah.
They're not taking responsibility for their life. And then they're like, well, actually I just got this little virus and I'm sick now. So it's a victim mindset. I think whether you believe that there's science for it or not, it's certainly a way to play the victim mindset. You take no responsibility for your illness, and your well-being at that when you blame these microorganisms. And even the most debilitating conditions, I know it can be challenging to sit here and think that meningitis isn't some random event that happens to some poor suckers. But at the same time, there might have been some sort of environmental heavy metal toxicity that happened to some poor suckers. But the problem is that we're not able to properly treat these individuals because we're trying to go and kill a microorganism or a virus when you actually should be detoxing heavy metals, or you should be focusing on eating real foods and getting natural sunlight and going out in nature and things like this, right? So there's many problems with it. There's certainly the science is there. If you're interested in the science, it's there. If you could care less about science, It's no way to live, in my opinion. It's no way to live in a victim mindset in any respect in your life. Even if you believe the science is for the germ theory, you should still take responsibility for your health. You should avoid toxicities and you should avoid deficiencies and you should avoid trauma to the best of your abilities. Sometimes it's impossible to avoid it completely, but you need to do your best and you need to take responsibility for your well-being, and you'll notice when you do that and you start consuming less toxins and avoiding the EMFs and going outside more and grounding and living more naturally and eating real food and having good relationships, you get sick a lot less. And then people don't tend to get debilitating diseases later in life, like chronic illnesses, because they don't have to suppress symptoms their whole life. But anyways, I'll let you chime in here. I could go on and on and on.
No, it's extremely fascinating, and I've genuinely never heard of this theory before. But I'm extremely fascinated, and I do love the way you tie it into personal responsibility. And in anecdotal experience, I have witnessed a great deal of people who live the exact lifestyle you've described, and they can't figure out why they're sick all the time.
Yeah.
And it would be most convenient for them for it to be no fault of their own.
And the pharmaceutical industry exacerbates the problem, right? So we have these acute illnesses like the flu, and we have these acute illnesses like, your cyclical sort of diseases. And even, you could throw in these childhood illnesses like chickenpox or measles or mumps or whatever. There's a good argument that these could be pejorative, right? You're just diagnosing some sort of natural cycle of detoxification. You get the sniffle every year because the seasons are changing and your mucous membranes need to adapt to the colder weather. So you get a sniffles and a sore throat and you shed off some sort of old layer and you develop a new layer of epithelial cells and you develop a stronger mucous membrane. There's likely a great argument that that's just some sort of natural part of life, right? But these acute illnesses, the problem is that we go and we get an antibiotic. And the problem is when you understand this terrain paradigm, you understand that these microorganisms are part of the healing process. And it's the same with symptoms. The symptoms are the healing process. So the analogy I use for symptoms is the broken finger example. When you break your finger, you crack it in half. What happens after you break your finger? Well, it swells up, it gets all red and puffy. You can barely move it, and it kind of hurts. You know, Nobody says that the inflammation caused your broken finger. But for some reason, with all these other diseases, we say, oh, it's the inflammation that causes it. So what do? You take an ibuprofen and you cut that inflammation off. Well, your body just developed that inflammation to heal your finger, to heal your body, right? The inflammation has many positive effects: increased blood flow to the area, increased permeability of the capillaries, right? So you're getting more healing properties in the site of disease, right? Whether it be that broken finger, whether it be a pancreas or whatever it is, right? The inflammation is the healing process, same as the microbes are the healing process. They are there to bioremediate the environment. There's a lot of evidence, and actually, you can find a lot of this in the soil sciences. Even parasites and fungus can rapidly consume heavy metals and consume dead and dying tissue and release the beneficial components to rebuild, right? So there's a lot of evidence that they're bioremediating factors. Bacteria, fungus, and parasites are there to clean up your environment and to allow your body to rebuild itself. Or they're going to kill you because you never actually got rid of the toxicity in the first place. But are they the ones killing you? Maybe they play a role in that process, but it's the underlying environment that is causing them to be around. See, a parasite can't stick around in a healthy gut because there's no food there for the parasite. Parasite can only be in an unhealthy gut where there's a lot of heavy metals or there's buildup of food that hasn't been digested, that's been stuck in your gut, right? So it's the underlying environment that's the cause. So cutting off these healing processes, whether they be symptoms or microbes, so through antibiotics or anti-inflammatories or anti-whatever, anti-bodily functioning, that toxicity gets stored and it gets stored further. And this is a concept called homotoxicology. And there's a guy who won a Nobel Prize for this concept as well. And not that he was all right, but he had a lot of great insight. And it's the development of these diseases. And you essentially go from acute to chronic illness through symptom suppression. That's a very general, broad understanding of how that works. Chronic illnesses, of course, are novel diseases. You can see increased rates of cancers of all types. You can see increased rates of heart disease and Alzheimer's, and all of these diseases are new age diseases. They didn't exist 200 years ago, right? This is because we suppress symptoms, right? This is because we are suppressing our healing functioning. And so that toxicity or our disease state gets stored further and further and further, right? Because if we can't get it out naturally, whereas it can't just, you know, it needs to find some sort of way out, right? So you get more chronic because your body's really trying to tell you, like, hey, listen, we got to do something here. So you develop these more chronic conditions. And, that's really the simple story of the development of these chronic illnesses. So that's called homotoxicology. There's one other phenomenon that's sort of interesting. And we go back to Antoine Béchamp. And I just want to mention this, these are not comprehensive explanations or arguments for these phenomenon, but there's a lot of great research. You can look into the Bigelsen brothers. They talk a lot about homotoxicology in the right way. So this other concept that a lot of people in the terrain community talk about, for the most part, everyone in the terrain community will talk about this, and it's pleomorphism. And this is essentially the changing nature of bacteria. And it stems from these little particles called microzymas. So we take it back to Antoine Béchamp. He's the one that sort of coined this pleomorphism. So it's the development of microorganisms in your body. And so this is a really interesting concept, and it's really central, right? You don't catch diseases, you develop them. You
You grow
don't
them.
catch exactly. You
Okay.
grow these things in your body, and it's all based on the environment. So you're growing bacteria, and it's from these little microzymas, right? So these little microzymas, they call them somatids, they call them a bunch of different things. They grow into the bacteria. And this, you can observe this under a specific type of microscopy called dark field microscopy, in which you can see blood in its live state. You can see the changing nature of bacteria. The bacteria can change shape. They go from rod to circle. You know, it can actually develop into fungal as well. And they say that it can develop into parasites as well. So you're actually developing these diseases. And of course, it's in response to the environment. So when you have that toxic environment, your body will develop these microorganisms to help fight it. Now, there are microorganisms that are alive all the time in our bodies that are part of the natural, processes of the bodies, especially the gut, but everywhere in the body. There is bacteria, your skin, your mucous membranes, in your brain, everywhere. There are microorganisms at all times, forever and ever. And these aren't necessarily the pathogenic ones. The pathogenic ones, the ones that are said to cause these infectious illnesses, are the ones that develop through this pleomorphic cycle in response to this toxic environment. So that's a really, really interesting thing to look into if you're interested in the terrain at all, because it's about the development of these microorganisms. And Antoine Béchamp did a lot of great experiments proving this pleomorphic cycle, and you can also see it under a microscope. That's been around for a very long time, actually.
So, in this pleomorphic cycle, would you say, does this play a role in your immune system? Are you developing these, what you people who believe in germ theory would think are the cause of the disease? Are you developing them to fight illness?
Yeah, so that's the thing. It's like we have this understanding that the immune system is this defense mechanism, right? But you have to change your understanding of that story, because that is a story. There is no empirical evidence that suggests that it's a defense mechanism, even though that's how it's described largely, even in academic settings. please, if there's anybody out there that could tell me some sort of empirical observation that points that it's a defense mechanism, I would be happy to see it. But it's not an objective story. It's not an objective induction whatsoever. It's a story. So you're hitting the nail on the head here because microorganisms and the immune system are one. They're both part of the cleanup crew. So a little analogy I like to use is you know, your you take your garbage out to the curb every week. The bacteria are like the garbage men, right? Your immune system is like the garbage truck that takes those bacteria, they take the garbage men and they take it to some sort of centralized location like a dump, right? And so the dump would be like the lymphatic system. So we know that the immune properties will kill the microorganisms or whatever, and they like gather this. This is the story now, right? This is like sort of getting away from the empiricism, but like this is an alternative story that you can tell yourself,
Okay.
right? So it's really important to understand that this is a story and not necessarily what's empirically observed. But they're taking it to this lymphatic system, and through the lymphatic system are you detoxifying, right? That's where you're sweating things out. That's where you're excreting things through your feces or your urine. That's where you may vomit it out if it's a very acute illness. Maybe not necessarily from the lymphatic system. Even through the sleep, there's some evidence to this lymphatic system that you can detoxify the brain. So you take it to the dump, and this is where the analogy falls apart because from the lymphatic system, from the dump, it goes and it just disperses out back into the environment in some sort of more conducive way, right? Because these are bioremediators. That's the thing about these bacteria is that they do these processes that our bodies can't. It's like when you think about plants. Plants can't uptake minerals from the ground. They need bacteria to do that process. The same
Okay.
as you can't digest food without bacteria in your gut because the bacteria are the ones that are digesting it, and whatever they shit out, that's what you're consuming. Same with plants, same with everything. So they can take a toxic environment and make it less toxic. They can take a dying environment and make it available for reconstruction. When a tree rots and it's covered in fungus and it's covered in insects and bugs and microbes and whatever, it rots down into the material, into some soil, into some bioavailable nutrients, minerals, whatever, for new life to come. Right? That's the process. It's all about bioremediation with these microorganisms.
Okay.
That's the really important thing to understand about the whole process, right? So that's why a lot of people in the train community love the gardening analogy because they say, and this gets back to the alchemical argument, that gardening and the healing arts are the exact same thing. It's all about the soil. It's all about the
Actually
environment.
thinking was as if
You know what I
your
mean?
gut is soil when you're describing it, as if you should think of your body and your being as a terrain.
Exactly. It's the internal terrain.
Okay.
And you can think about your internal terrain and your external terrain, which is your environment, but they're not separate. It's all one terrain. It's all one thing. There is no separation. A separation is just what we tell ourselves. It's a story again that we are somehow separate from our environment, which is such a foolish thing to think.
Hmm.
It's impossible to isolate an individual from their environment. It's impossible.
It comes back to that interconnectivity we were talking about at the beginning.
100%.
It's the underlying narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you were to recommend one book for somebody interested in this, one book or one author, if you were to narrow it down for the best way to get your foot in the door, who would you recommend?
Think about that a lot, and I can't give you a good answer. I can't. I haven't figured out the number one source to give you. You know, because it shakes your worldview. Like if you're gonna get in depth into the science of things, you gotta go deep. The best starting point. I really love Daniel Reuter's book on how to catch a cold. I think you start. I think you start. It's because it's different for everyone. I think you start with whatever you believe the least. If you don't think that there's any possibility that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, you start with Inventing the AIDS Virus by Peter Duesberg. If
Okay.
you can't comprehend the flu and how the flu can't be caused by some sort of contagious microorganism, you start with The Invisible Rainbow, or you start with Can You Catch a Cold by Daniel Roitas. You know, if you really want a holistic perspective and history of the germ theory and the terrain, you go listen to episodes 2, 3, and 4 of my podcast. Because I did a recount of the entire history of the germ theory and the entire history of the terrain and all pertinent sources. And I went over the sources as well. You can find a more comprehensive list of the sources in those episodes. And I tried to give a general, more systematic understanding of the terrain and the fall of the germ theory, the problems within the germ theory, and briefly the problems with the scientific method as well, used in the germ theory model of things. It's really hard to narrow it down, but it depends. You got to go. Honestly, the best advice I give is go where you don't want to go.
Okay.
And you get back to Jung, you get back to Jordan Peterson there. You got to face that shadow. You got to fight the dragon.
You got to
That's
reach
what
all
it's
the
all
way to
about.
hell.
You got to go all the way to hell, man. Like, you got to, like, whatever you think is going to trigger you the most, that's where you start. You figure out, why the hell has this triggered me so much? Like, why can't I grasp this? Why can't I understand this? And listen to it, but be genuine. Anyone can flick through a book or listen to a podcast and think about other things. You know what I mean? Like, you have to approach it with a sense of curiosity. And when you do, I mean, personally, I think that if you're objective, there's no way that you could disagree with the germ theory, or there's no way that you could agree with the germ theory, you know, because objectively, there's just not enough evidence there. And if you're a science head, if you're a science guy, and you're like all about reading the literature, start with the contagion studies. Go read the story of Gallup's Island. It was the scientific experiment done in the 1918 with the Spanish flu, where they took 100 military men and they exposed them to people with the Spanish flu, and they had these infected individuals cough and sneeze and spit, and they even injected blood from the sick people into the healthy people, and they took mucus and they injected it into the people's mouths and their nasal nostrils, whatever. They did every method that they could possibly do onto these healthy individuals, and not one of them got sick. Not one of them got sick, and this was said to be the most contagious illness in the history, right? So if you're convinced by literature, you could start with those studies. Start with the literature. You know, if you like podcasts, start with a podcast.
Yeah, or
So
sometimes you
depends.
all of the above, right? Listen to the
That's
podcast while you're at work and read the book on your breaks.
Yeah, all the
No,
above. It's all about you.
this is extremely interesting and entirely foreign to me. I really do checking this out.
Yeah, it's
I
fun. I mean, I love it. Like, I love it. I love studying it. I've loved studying it for the last 4 years. It shook my whole worldview, changed my whole direction in life, put me onto a more meaningful direction. So I have a lot of passion for it. Do I think you need to understand the intricacies of the terrain to be healthy? Not necessarily, but I think it's difficult to be healthy with this understanding of the germ theory shadowing over you, because you're not going to be taking responsibility for your health. But do I think that you need to understand the intricacies of pleomorphism and bioremediation and the whole history of the terrain? No, you don't need to understand any of this to be healthy. Being healthy is very simple. You live in accordance with nature as much as you possibly can. That doesn't mean you can't have a phone or a laptop or you can't live in a house. But it means that you got to go outside every day and you got to move your body every day and you got to sit less. And, maybe you sit on the ground. I'm sitting on the ground right now. That's more natural than sitting in a chair. Maybe you don't eat your shit processed food and you eat real whole foods. You eat what your ancestors ate. And they weren't just eating plants, unfortunately.
yeah, not like some
So
would have you believe.
yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
I've heard you use the term primal diet. Would you like to define that a bit and explain why you adhere to it?
I mean, some people do, here's the thing, the primal diet. I mean, you got to give credit to Genus Vonderplanets. He's the one who sort of coined this primal diet, and it's like a raw animal diet, essentially. You eat raw animal products, meat, milk, eggs, everything, every part of the animal, head to toe, nose to tail, some say. Do you need to eat all raw food to be healthy? I mean, I think it's a great method of healing. Agenus certainly has a lot of evidence for that, and there's a lot of people in the community that have evidence for that. Our ancestors did cook some of their food. It was also very natural for them to eat raw organs. Like during a hunt, it was very natural for them to eat the organ meats while they're dressing the animal. Right then and there, they'd take a bite out of the heart and the liver and the whatever. You know, they ate their cooked meats and things like that. And great book there. And this might be the best starting point. And I've thought about this. I can't believe I didn't mention it. There's a book by Weston A. Price, and he was a dentist. And he wrote Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And he studied all of the remaining untouched native tribes around the world. I think there were 13 tribes from, up north in North America, all the way to the islands of the Aborigines in Australia and off the coast there. And, some of them ate more fish, some of them ate rodents, some of them ate big game, some of them only ate salmon. Some of them even ate oats, like the Gaelic natives. Some of them ate a little bit of rye bread now and then, but there was a specific way of preparing it, right? It was fermented and it was soaked and it was, so there are specific preparation activities when it comes to plants, especially, but a lot of them ate mostly animal foods. Um, so an ancestral diet, it's about eating what's local. Say you didn't have a Sobeys or a grocery store near you. What would you eat? Look to your environment.
Mm-hmm.
That's the natural human diet. Now, of course, here in Nova Scotia, you can't fish salmon anymore and eat it because we fish the hell out of it. Same in Toronto. If you live in Toronto, you used to be able to fish salmon in Toronto. There was more salmon than you could shake a stick at. But, unfortunately, that was ruined by colonization when they fished all the salmon out of existence. Used to be able to eat bison. Now there's no bison that roam the plains. They're trying to get some populations back, but so maybe it isn't enough at this point in time to say just look at your environment, but you can certainly adapt that the best of your ability. Maybe instead of eating bison, you eat, cows.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe instead of eating salmon, you eat, maybe you shouldn't eat farm raised salmon, but maybe you eat other fish
Yeah,
or you eat,
trout, pickerel, depending on what's native to your
yeah,
environment.
good to eat what's around you. And, is it bad to import food? Some people say it is. I think you should just eat whole food. Just eat whole foods. And if you're really sick, it may be good to do some sort of intense diet. Like maybe you can try this raw primal diet if you're really ill. But, if you're generally healthy, just eat whole foods and eat what feels good for you. Keep a food journal and
Mm-hmm.
eat what feels good. Document, be objective. When you eat this, you feel bloated. When you eat this, you have lots of energy. So it's individual, but I mean, just eat whole food. That's my diet advice.
No, I think it's very noticeable myself. I had read a book once called The Sapien Diet, and a lot of it was in line with the same notions you speak to. And the examples it had of eating grains were also there was particular methods of fermentation and things like that. Everything plant related or grain related had very specific prep preparatory methods attached to it. And most of it, though, was absolutely animal products. And it had led to me, I myself, I don't eat seed oils or grains. And I'd swear it's extremely different. Just even like you said, how bloated you'll be or how much energy you have, quality of sleep.
Naturally, think about how hard it is to make a loaf of bread.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like to grow the grain, to harvest it, to process it, properly without a machine. Like you got to hand crush that shit, and you might had a even a stone wheel or something like that. That's even a nice piece of technology. But think about that in a natural setting. If you had hand tools, how would you prepare a loaf of bread? So if you're gonna eat bread, eat it sparingly too.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like if you're gonna dabble in it, make sure it's just like proper sourdough bread, and all organic. You don't want to be consuming that toxic glyphosate. But don't eat a half a loaf of sourdough every day either.
yeah,
Because it's about moderation too and balance.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. It's been a very illuminating discussion on realms of science that I didn't know existed. I'd love to have you back on in the future. I will seek out and read these books, and perhaps I can contribute more to the discussion if you'd like to go over these subjects again one day.
Always up to talk about this stuff. I hope you guys can hear the passion in my voice behind the research that I've done, because it is truly out of passion. Even with my social medias now, like Instagram, podcast, YouTube, whatever, I haven't made a penny off of it. So it's all passion. It's all love.
Honestly, even through the stream, through the glowing spirit box in front of me, I could feel the passion when you speak about it.
Good. Good, good. It's
It
good to
really
hear.
comes across. No,
Yeah,
thank you a great deal for doing this.
certainly. Yeah, glad to be back on at some point in the future.